Homelander has the power of a god. He can fly, destroy cities, kill almost anyone instantly. But emotionally, he's basically a deeply traumatized toddler with laser eyes. And somehow, millions of people are obsessed with him. Which raises a disturbing psychological question. Why does the human brain become fascinated by people who should completely disgust us? Because Homelander is not just evil, he's psychologically broken in a very human way, and that makes him terrifyingly compelling. Most villains want power. Homelander wants love. That's what makes him dangerous. At first glance, Homelander looks unstoppable, confident, dominant, superior to everyone around him. But underneath all of that, he's emotionally starving. The terrifying part about narcissistic personalities is that many of them secretly hate themselves. Their ego becomes armor, a performance designed to hide deep emotional fragility. And Homelander is basically the most extreme version of this imaginable. He constantly needs validation, approval, admiration, attention. Without it, he begins emotionally collapsing in real time.
Which explains why
Homelander reacts to rejection like a child having a psychological breakdown. Someone criticizes him? Rage. Someone fears him instead of loving him? Rage. Someone stops admiring him? Existential crisis. This is not confidence. It's emotional dependency disguised as superiority. And the creepy part is, real narcissistic personalities often behave similarly. Not necessarily with laser vision, hopefully, but emotionally, very similar. Psychologists often describe narcissistic personalities as people trapped between grandiosity and deep shame. On the outside, I am superior to everyone. Internally, please don't abandon me. And Homelander's childhood explains almost everything. He wasn't raised by parents, he was raised in a laboratory. No affection, no emotional safety, no healthy attachment, no unconditional love. Just experiments. Isolation, performance, control. Which creates one of the most psychologically dangerous combinations possible. Unlimited power combined with emotional deprivation. A child who never receives love does not magically stop needing love. The need stays there. It just mutates into something darker. And this is exactly what happens to Homelander. He becomes obsessed with control because control feels safer than vulnerability. Because vulnerable people get hurt. And deep down, Homelander is terrified of being emotionally powerless again. This is why milk becomes such a weird recurring symbol in the show. It's not just shock humor. Psychologically, it represents emotional infancy, comfort, nurturing, motherhood, the emotional security he never received. Which honestly makes some scenes both disturbing and weirdly sad at the same time. And this emotional contradiction is exactly why audiences become obsessed with villains like Homelander, because the human brain is fascinated by damaged people with power. We hate him, fear him, but part of the audience also pities him. And once empathy enters the equation, our brain becomes emotionally conflicted. Psychologists call this the halo effect. When someone is charismatic, attractive, powerful, or emotionally compelling, the brain unconsciously softens moral judgment. Which explains why audiences often forgive behavior in fictional characters that would horrify them in real life. If Homelander looked weak and pathetic all the time, people would simply hate him. But because he looks powerful, confident, and emotionally intense, the brain becomes curious instead of purely disgusted. And there's another uncomfortable truth here. Many people secretly fantasize about freedom from social rules. Homelander says what he wants, does what he wants, takes what he wants. And part of the human brain finds that intoxicating. Not because people want to become murderers, but because modern life forces most people to constantly suppress anger, frustration, insecurity, and emotional impulses. Homelander represents psychological release without restraint. He is basically human ego without consequences, which is both horrifying and weirdly entertaining. But perhaps the darkest part of Homelander's psychology is that, despite all his power, he remains emotionally fragile. A god emotionally controlled by public approval. A superhuman destroyed by loneliness. A monster terrified of rejection. And honestly, that may be the most human thing about him. This is why audiences become emotionally trapped by characters like Homelander. Not because we admire evil itself, but because we recognize something psychologically real underneath the evil. The fear of abandonment, the hunger for validation, the desperate need to feel important, the terror of being emotionally insignificant. Homelander simply expresses these human insecurities at an extreme level, which makes him both terrifying and painfully recognizable. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth about villain psychology. The scariest villains are not the ones who feel inhuman. They're the ones who reveal distorted parts of ourselves we don't want to admit exist. Because underneath the lasers, the rage, and the narcissism, Homelander is still just a deeply damaged child, begging the world to love him. And unfortunately, people with unlimited power rarely become less dangerous when they feel emotionally unloved. So here's my question for you. If you've ever felt like you needed approval just to feel okay, what's the one thing keeping you grounded right now? Let me know in the comments.